The house was old. It must have been 100 years old, thick brick walls, high, 3 meters, ceilings, parquet. Even in the common corridor. It is pleasant to live in such houses with a lot of space and volume. Of course, there are also shortcomings, like old pipes and indestructible mosquitoes in the basements. This house, in addition to all its advantages and disadvantages, had one more minus. A completely crazy layout. The entrance to my apartment was located at the end of a separate corridor. Moreover, it was the only door in the corridor in general, so I didn't even know my neighbors. I suspect that this location of the apartment was due to the fact that the house was completed in parts, and my current apartment was completed later, or previously had a separate entrance. However, this only matters because the apartment was rented. Previously, some pensioners lived here, but the children took them to their home, and the living space became available for rent. Since I came to this apartment through my acquaintances, there were no special problems with the settlement and the terms of the lease. I agreed that I would make a small repair and get rid of the old furniture. Fortunately, there were no problems with the latter. No one thought to protect the old Soviet cabinets and cupboards. That's when I stumbled upon the window. On that day, the weather was sunny outside, rare small clouds hovered in the sky. In general, the weather was excellent. However, I did not enjoy it, but was engaged in a struggle with one of the old cabinets. Its back wall had about a dozen thick oak planks that was screwed to the wall. Strictly speaking, the cabinet itself literally hung on these boards, and dismantling it turned into a real nightmare. I was wet with sweat. I finally overcame the damn wall, and was surprised to find a window behind it. Old shutters, gray with time and bad weather, dirty glass, and light oozing from outside. I was quite surprised to find a window in the far wall of the apartment. When I finished with the boards, I opened it and looked out. It opened onto a small courtyard. More precisely, I would say, well, I did not see either an entrance or an exit from there. What is even more interesting, I did not see any other windows. It looks like it was just punched in the wall to please the former owners. Shrugging, I closed it and returned to my unending struggle with the furniture. The window, of course, puzzled me a little. I planned to install a horizontal bar in place of the closet, but the damned hole in the wall changed everything. I even wanted to brick it, but then I thought that it would be much better to put my desktop by the window. The courtyard outside was not large, and, apparently, the sun never peeped in here, except on a summer afternoon. In addition, there was a small canopy above the window, apparently designed to protect from rain. From the inside, the walls of the house were painted in a light orange color. It looked pretty nice by the way, and oddly enough the paint was not affected by the elements. Apparently, due to the small influence of the sun, the paint did not fade or peel off. A month has passed. I finally figured out my business and arranged the apartment to my liking. I slept, ate and lived, not even suspecting what was on the other side of the old shutters. I first noticed this on a rainy day. The rain drummed on the windows. I just returned home, wet to the skin and angry as 100 devils. The day that began with a cloudless sky turned into a real biblical flood in just 2 hours. Unfortunately, it was not possible to take a taxi. The city was paralyzed by traffic jams, and no one wanted to take an order. After undressing and taking a hot shower, I sat down at a book. I wasn't in the mood to work or a movie, and the book was a great distraction. Deciding that it would be most convenient at my desk, I flopped into an armchair and deepened in reading. Since the sunlight from the window provided excellent lighting, when it dawned on me that the sun was in that window, I don't know, half an hour, I jumped up as if stung and stared blankly at the sunlit courtyard outside. Did the rain stop so quickly? Somewhat discouraged, I went to the rest of the windows. Rain and clouds, and then the sun, albeit not visible from the courtyard and the ringing azure of a clear sky. My hands shook. Have I lost it? Is someone playing me for a fool? Looking at the window as if it was about to throw itself at me, I backed out of the room and went to the kitchen. So, first, coffee, strong, and some cognac. No, a lot, even more, for nerves. Next is a cigarette. The rain outside was pounding on the windows, hinting that it doesn't happen everywhere. It's raining everywhere and the sun is out. Natural anomaly. I propped my head on my hand, took a deep puff, and coughed. Yes, I rarely smoke, so, if I move my head, then technology is man's best friend. She won't let you down. Armed with a telephone, I peered into the room. The window shines brightly on a sunny day. With shaking hands, I pointed the camera at him and snapped a photo. For a moment the screen went blank, and I was already prepared to see a blank wall instead of a window, and myself in the strong hands of the orderlies. But nothing of the sort happened. The phone correctly showed the rectangle of the window flooded with light. Devilry. It doesn't happen. Or does it happen? I contemplated my actions. Share my find. But with whom? Friends. Well, I have one or two reliable people. But what if it's dangerous? Then I'll put their lives at risk, and that's unacceptable. Walking around the apartment, I weighed all the pros and cons of the option to tell my friends. In the end, I decided that it was better to do the reconnaissance myself, and then decide what to do next. The next week was spent preparing. I bought climbing equipment, ropes, carabiners, belays, and other necessary things. I decided to start the study with the simplest, the descent. And so, a week and 2 days later, on Saturday morning, I ate a light breakfast and went to the window. I pushed the table aside, fixed the cables in several places. In case at least one knot could not stand it, the rest would ensure. I leaned out of the window up to my waist and looked around. Smooth walls, a canopy, and, somewhere on the floor above, the edge of the roof. The ground is 4 meters below. I forgot about this, that I live on the second floor. Exhaling and pulling the cable a couple of times, will it hold up? I leaned out of the window and dangled my legs. I was trembling a little. One small jump for a man. I began to carefully slide down. In the end, I hung a couple of meters above the ground, clinging to the cable with my hands. Cursing to myself, I pushed off the wall and jumped down. The ground hit my feet painfully, and I fell on my side. Looks like it didn't break anything. I got up and looked around. Nothing incredible. Dense, trampled earth under my feet, walls, and a lonely window, from which I crawled out. I tilted my head up and looked up at the sky. It was clean and blue. Does it happen differently here? I took a deep breath of air in order to bawl something out, but then stopped short. Who knows what could happen here? What if I attract a predator? Suppressing a scream ready to burst out, I exhaled noisily. Well, the expedition to the next world is over. Time to go home. Groaning and snoring, I climbed back. The blood roared like a blacksmith's hammer in my ears, and my heart seemed about to jump out of my chest. No, it's certainly not a 4-meter rise. I was all on my nerves. Hands were shaking, head was spinning. Another world. It looks like it. There were millions, no, billions of questions, ideas and plans swarming in my brain. No, we need to calm down. I pulled myself together with difficulty and, giggling like an idiot, sat down in a chair. Plans for Operation Roof were already beginning to unfold in my head. A month, that's how much it took me to prepare for the second stage. Having bought materials, I managed to build something like a balcony sticking out 2 meters from the window. In addition, instead of the old frame, I put a normal double-glazed window. There was still not enough to blow through and outside, under the visor. I placed a roller shutter. After all, you never know what muck can be found there. I also appreciated how best to climb onto the roof. The answer was obvious: make a ladder. A lot of difficulties arose with this. Putting a 5-meter-long ladder on a narrow 2-meter balcony is not the best idea. In the end, I bought 24 steel brackets and made an impromptu mounting ladder by simply driving these same brackets into the wall. It took several days, mainly because I experimented a lot with how to fix them. My first attempt almost led to death. One of the brackets broke out of the mount, and I flew from the height of the 3rd floor straight to the ground. The only thing that saved me was that my leg got tangled in a rope hanging from the balcony, and, having broken a couple of boards, I was hung upside down. One way or another, but after a while the work was over. I gazed contentedly at the marvel of my engineering, the crooked and slanting string of staples that stretched to the very edge of the roof. When I drove in the last one, it cost me a truly inhuman effort not to look over the edge. It was supposed to be my moment of triumph, not a furtive glance over the edge of a tin roof. And now, that day has come. I prepared thoroughly, a backpack with provisions for the day, a care mat, a supply of water, a flashlight, my cables and fasteners, as well as my main weapon, a camera. I asked a friend to use it, along with a telescopic lens, a macro lens, and a regular wide-angle lens, and of course the compass. I didn't think of taking a tripod, but my equipment already made me nervous while climbing up. I stubbornly stared at the tin of the roof. Here flashed its end, a strip of sky. No, boy, be patient. Pull up, get on my feet, take a breath. Fix my backpack. Ready? It's time. Closing my eyes, I raised my head, and after waiting a couple of seconds until my heart calmed down, I prepared to open them. What is waiting for me? Garden of Eden. Scorched desert. Endless steppe expanse. Fog and rocks sticking out of it in places. To be honest, I was a little disappointed. The sight was not very impressive. Lonely blocks of stone, like icebergs, froze in the waves of floating fog. Sometimes the fog rose 40 meters high, forming bizarre rings and curls. I went to the edge of the roof, counting the steps. 8, 30, 100. I stopped at the edge of the roof and looked back. Interesting place. I walked as many as 100 steps, but visually the distance was 20 to 30 meters. Spatial anomalies. An unpleasant chill ran down his back. If the metric of space is violated here, then, perhaps, not everything has been thankful to God since time. I suddenly thought that maybe while I walked these 100 steps, a whole day at home could pass. And I have to work the day after tomorrow. Somehow, the thought that I might be late for work canceled out my desire to explore this strange world. I rushed back. 3, 5, 8. I almost fell down, straight into my courtyard. What the heck? I looked back. Well, yes. 20 meters, 100 steps there, 8 steps back. How is it easy it is to run back? Going downstairs, I rushed to the computer. Number and time. Come on. With trembling hands, I hit the calendar on the second attempt. Same day. Just 20 minutes later, taking a deep breath, I sat down on a chair. The time is okay. Well, then back. Anxiety again gave way to excitement, and, having refreshed myself with a sandwich, I went back. Climbing onto the roof, I remembered what I always wanted to test as a child. Well, let's look at the compass. I took it out and stared inquisitively at the arrow. She made a half turn and froze, pointing to the north. I lifted my head to check the sun, and froze with my jaw dropped. There was no sun. Looking around, I realized another important thing: there were no shadows. Generally, as if on a cloudy day, colors and contrast were added. For some reason, this circumstance greatly disturbed me. Light from nowhere. Mystic. On the other hand, windows leading to other worlds are not everyday life either. I went to the edge of the roof, not forgetting to keep an eye on the compass. The arrow continued to look stubbornly in one direction. This time the edge of the roof was 70 paces away. Having noted this figure to myself, I looked over the edge. From the outside, the house looked very dilapidated. The empty eye sockets of the windows gazed wistfully at the gloomy landscape, strewn with fog. The mist, on the other hand, beat against the walls of the building in tidal waves, like a boundless milky ocean. It seemed to me that there was some movement down there, but no matter how much I peered, I did not see anything. After looking around, I went around the perimeter of the roof. The tin springed under my feet and groaned loudly, bending under my weight. I took a couple of photos with the wide-angle lens, then attached the telescopic lens and took a couple of shots of one of the rocks in the distance. Inspection of the perimeter showed only one thing: there was no way to go down, at least I did not find it. At the same time, I noticed that, as it seems to me, the fog lifted a little. I wasn't completely sure until, as I passed another side of the house, I noticed that the fog had already risen to the level of the windows on the second floor. Previously, it barely reached the top of the windows of the first. For some reason this made me feel uncomfortable. At the same time, I just now noticed that it was starting to get dark. Moreover, if earlier the sky was full of pure azure, now it was equally evenly filled with the crimson of the sunset. I have to admit, this whole thing made me feel a bit uneasy. More importantly, I noticed that shadows now appeared for the first time. The huge boulders scattered across the valley now resembled a clenching titanic fist. All the shadows were directed in my direction, or at least towards my house. I hurried back. Step 2, 10, 100. But my courtyard was not approaching. I switched to running. For some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. 20 minutes later, all wet and with a breaking heart, I almost fell off the damn roof. I turned around, seeing the fog begin to dance in the embers of the dying day at roof level. Another minute, and it will rush to me. Slipping on the steps, I quickly began to descend. The boards crunched plaintively when I jumped on them with all my might, passing half a meter of steps, and rolled head over heels into the apartment. Immediately slammed the window and lowered the blind with a clang. There was deathly silence and total darkness in the apartment. Turning on the flashlight, I reached for the switch and turned on the light, immediately staring out the window. But there was only a lowered shutter and a glare of light from my lantern. Without undressing, extremely exhausted, I collapsed on the bed and fell asleep without dreams. The text looped a couple of times to show that the place beyond the window was endless. I opened one eye and looked around the room. My body ached after yesterday's run. There was a light bulb under the ceiling. Groaning, I got up and stretched. Glancing through the usual window overlooking my usual street, I was convinced that it was another cloudy day outside. I glanced sideways at the window and the blind. No, today, no expeditions. Tomorrow at work, it was not enough to run from the fog again. Once again mentally repeating this phrase to myself. I grinned. Moron. I suppose the house is in the middle of a swamp. For a swamp, fogs are the norm, even on a clear day. And in the evening, evaporation condenses better. So it rises. Spread the mystic here. Moron. The day went by as a routine. Whatever my guesses about the window and the fog, I tried to forget about them. And only in the evening I sat down at the computer to look at the photos. To my great regret, they turned out to be illuminated, every one of them. It was already complete idiocy. You can't light up digital photos. For this, it is necessary that an unpleasant guess made me shudder. Radiation. You motherfucking explorer. What if it's phony there, like in Chernobyl? And I was walking around in fucking pants and a t-shirt. This unpleasant thought left me sleepless, and I tossed and turned all night, mentally preparing to see my hair fall out in the morning and my organs turn into a kind of jelly. But the morning came, and there were no signs of radiation sickness. However, I ordered a Geiger counter, and when I got it in my hands, I put it in my backpack. I won't bore you with the details of experiments and tests. I can only say that there was no radiation there. Generally, even background radiation. I did not dare to venture for more than half an hour, and was mainly engaged in the study of the physical properties of the newly discovered world. So, for example, I found out that the distance here depends on desires. The more you want to get somewhere, the further you go in, apparently. My escape from the fog became successful solely because I already thought more about how not to spit out my lungs than about saving myself from danger. Sometimes, having cleared my mind of any desires, I overcame the entire roof in 3 steps. Once I left my notebook at home and must have walked half a kilometer until I reached the courtyard. In addition, I found another important thing out. The compass did not point north at all. It pointed to the window. I spent one day investigating. One of the most significant experiments was the establishment of the level of the foggy tide at night. I found a special paint that was sensitive to moisture. In the fog, it became a poisonous yellow color. Having painted a 3-meter board with it, I installed it vertically on the roof. In the morning I checked the result. 2 meters exactly plus a couple of stripes up to 3 meters. Apparently, emissions similar to those that I observed earlier. The next step was the tower project. It took almost 3 months, but in the end, I built it. 5-meter observation tower. It was truly a hell of a job. I never thought that it was so hard to build such structures alone. However, one way or another, the last nail was driven in, and I could proceed. At the same time, during the construction process, I built a small winch at the top, which immeasurably facilitated the delivery of even large and heavy loads to the roof. Frankly, I was terribly afraid. No, not this way. I was so afraid that I put off my nightly sortie for almost 4 days. The tower, covered with sensitive paint, made it possible to find out that some fog emissions reached 4 meters. Considering how much he scared me, I did not immediately manage to decide to spend the night on that very tower. Having dressed warmly, stocking up on food and 2 thermoses of hot tea, lamps, including 2 kerosene lamps, 2 electric and a couple of chemical torches, I set off on my hike. I climbed out on the tower just as it began to get dark. From a height, I could see the picture better. The house was located in the center of a huge valley, at its very bottom. The fog that seemed to me to rise at night, in fact, just filled the valley, flowing in from somewhere outside. The first couple of hours brought nothing new. The fog swirled, rolling on the walls of my house. Then he crawled over the edge of the roof, and thousands of ghostly snakes rushed in my direction. I watched, mesmerized by the graceful dance of the shadows. It was beautiful in its own way, although the silent advance of this whitish wall almost forced me to go down and run home. The sky, which gradually turned crimson, then turned black and red, and finally the last colors faded. A dome of absolute blackness tipped over me. The darkness, dispersed by 2 lamps, seemed to become thicker with every moment. I literally felt how the elastic sphere of darkness was shrinking around me. Feeling claustrophobic over me, I lit one of the kerosene lamps. This helped for a while, the dance of living fire. Its warmth and soft, even light drove away gloomy thoughts and feelings for a while. I even plucked up the courage to tie one electric lantern to a cable and lower it off the tower into a raging sea of mist. I'm not sure what I saw, but it seemed to me that a huge, about 3 meters, pale ghostly hand woven from fog tried to grab it, but fell apart in the air. And it was dispelled in the air. Except for the chilling sensation of being watched, the night passed quietly. As the sky brightened, the fog receded, and an hour later the valley returned to its usual form. A week later, I decided to share my find with my friends. Considering that I did not meet anything dangerous outside the window, I decided to dedicate a few of my closest acquaintances to my discovery. We agreed that we would keep the secret for as long as possible. We had no doubt that sooner or later we would either let it slip or just get tired of the idea and pass it on to who needs it, but we didn't want to just give up the glory of the pioneers. Idiots. In general, the team now included me, Garik, and Slava. We studied together at the university, and I knew both of them as flaky. Garik, however, hesitated, and for a long time tried to convince us that, well, what the hell? I have a soul in my heels from this mysticism, but Slava convinced him to stay, swearing that at the first sign of danger we turn off the shop and stop all activities. Well, we report where necessary, of course. Our first outing took place a week later. During this time, I managed to share all the information I collected, from the properties of space to my guesses about the fog and its tides. The sight of another world affected my friends much more than any belief. Garik, who seemed to think until the very end that I was cheating him, and all this was some kind of stupid prank, was dumbfounded at the sight of the endless sea of fog. By the way, he also drew attention to the fact that all those several dozen rocks that are visible around are arranged, as it were, in ascending order, and that in general it resembles some kind of giant flower, in the center of which we are. In general, my friends got carried away. The evenings were spent arguing and conjecturing, and they spent almost more nights at my house than at theirs. Perhaps because of the constant presence of friends, I did not immediately notice any changes. I don't know what else to call it, but the apartment began to change. No, not that things were disappearing, or some kind of mysticism was happening. It just sometimes seemed that a cup of tea was standing nearby. I reached out for it with my hand, but found that it was much further than it seemed. Although, if I repeated the action, staring at her, everything fell into place. Slava explained this by the fact that we are accustomed to the other world and reach for objects, trying not to reach out. I found the argument quite plausible, and henceforth tried to carefully monitor my actions. Oddities sometimes continued, but I tended to think that I was just not always focused. Our first breakthrough came out by accident. Since the past 6 months I have been working on window. The apartment more and more began to resemble a hostel. A battery of empty bottles of water, beer and juices, a mountain of unwashed dishes and a bunch of pizza boxes. Also, I never threw out the old shutters. It was them, thinking about something, Slava picked with a knife. And it was there that he noticed the letters, more precisely, their remains and traces. Having cleaned the frames of dirt and layers of paint, we were convinced that he was right. The shutters outside and inside were covered with a pattern of some kind of squiggles. After a couple of hours of searching on the internet, we came to the conclusion that they most of all resemble Indian scripts, although a number of characters were unfamiliar. But some hieroglyphs could be interpreted tolerably in Hindi. Unfortunately, the translation was not given to us. It turns out some kind of babble of a mentally ill person, a set of letters. Nothing more. When trying to put the pronunciation into Google Translator, we got some unintelligible set of howls, wheezing and guttural shouts. Some Lovecraft, Cthulhu in the tank, Gary commented. The find, however, puzzled us. After rummaging, we found out that such signs on the windows can serve as amulets against evil spirits, and breaking them is extremely imprudent. With a few nervous laughs, we dismissed the idea. For about half an hour, then, just in case, we decided to reproduce these scribbles on the window frame. I'm willing to argue, while each of us thought only one thing, if only it was some kind of superstitious nonsense. This took about an hour, an indelible marker on guard against evil spirits. I chuckled to myself, Ghostbusters. However, be that as it may, we continued to work. When everything was ready, we stared silently and tensely at the window. I reached out and slammed it shut, turning the handle down. For a minute we stared intently at the frame, waiting for I don't even know what. To see a terrible face on the other side, hear the afterlife howl, to see a ghost beating through the window with a muzzle distorted with rage. After standing in silence for more than 1 minute, we exhaled. And then there was a heavy blow from above, from which we jumped. Then, the second, and loud curses from the neighbors. We laughed together, feeling the tension release. In the evening we had a small party and, having crushed a case of beer, drunk and satisfied, we said goodbye and dispersed. I went to my room, and my friends went home. At night I was plagued by nightmares. I frantically ran away from the swirling wall of fog through the back streets of my house. The corridors twisted and never ended, and I kept running and running, unable to get rid of the feeling of complete hopelessness, despair and pure Animal horror that drove me on and on. I met the morning exhausted, as if I were running a marathon. Friends also referred to feeling bad, but looking at the rumpled faces of friends on Skype. I liked them, realized that the night was unsuccessful for everyone. Week later, we gradually forgot about that nightmarish night, and the nightmares, having once visited us, receded. In addition, it seems to me that the strangeness with space has ceased. I attributed this to the psychological effect, and the tension subsided. Gradually, we plucked up the courage for another sortie. We decided to kill two birds with one stone. Firstly, Garik discovered something in my exposed photos. According to him, the flare was not complete, some parts of the image had a slightly different gradient. And he suggested that it most of all looked like a photo of fog. Given its maximum level, he suggested trying to take a couple of photos from the tower, and at the same time set the camera to video camera mode and leave it to shoot at night. Secondly, Slava suggested a rather bold experiment. Leave a live rat in the fog overnight and see what happens. On the last point, we argued for a long time, but in the end we capitulated, recognizing that it was not possible to check on people. And in general, what could be terrible in a fog? Although the latter we rather tried to convince ourselves. In the evening, when the sky was already beginning to turn purple, we began our daring sortie. Slava and I moved a couple of steps away from the edge of the roof and set up a cage with a rat. The animal did not show any anxiety and washed itself peacefully. We poured food, added water, and covered the cage with a warm blanket. It was quite cool here at night. And it was not our plan to freeze the poor animal. Meanwhile, Garik was fiddling on the tower, having snapped off a couple of panoramic photos on a digital camera. He did the same on a film one. He did not look at the results. Dusk was already gathering, and we had to hurry. Having arranged a couple of cameras connected to an uninterruptible power supply, he quickly went downstairs. In a couple of minutes we were already at home, slammed the window and lowered the shutter. We somehow did not want to observe the whitish swaying mass outside the window, and we stared at the photographs. At first, I thought this was not the right picture, until I noticed a familiar fence at the bottom of the frame. It was he who was on the edge of the roof of the house. Further, something unpleasant began. Everything was filled with fog, in which tall, skinny, asymmetrical figures with several limbs were guessed. Just looking at them was creepy. We need to take the rat away. Slava wanted to get up from his chair, but we sat him back down. It was late, and everyone knew it. If this is what the fog hides, then it is better not to climb there. Generally, brick everything and forget all the photos were similar. Fog, unpleasant, terrifying figures by their very appearance in the sky. Oh, this is truly an apocalyptic sight, like a whole ocean of blood up there. This nightmarish roof of the world rested on 7 colossal columns of pure darkness. Each took its base from one of the large rocks. We, dying with fear, went to the window, cautiously looking around the corner, ready to recoil at any moment. The sound repeated. It was as if tiny claws were scraping against the shutter. Rat. She somehow got out of the cage, and now she's scratching back. Slava rushed to open the window, but Garik and I held him back. Opening the window when there is this damn fog and night is extremely unwise. Outside, a plaintive squeak was heard, muffled by the shutters and the window. And from that it was even more heartbreaking and frightened. Sorry, my friend, we should have taken these photos a day earlier. The squeak was repeated and suddenly died down on a high note. We stood, listening intently to the silence, but nothing happened. That night we had to fill up hard to sleep. The plaintive squeak of a nameless rodent, full of despair and entreaty, haunted my dreams. Morning came on the head with a forged boot. Every movement hurts. Garik and Slava looked crumpled and dejected. We came to ourselves all day and only in the evening were able to think soberly. And we were not drawn to puke from trying to change the position in which we spent most of the day. We held a council. Should we try to take the rodent, if it is still alive, and, more importantly, we should have taken the cameras. Despite all the horror of the true appearance of that world, curiosity still lived in us. The final decision was made. Garik went to develop film photos. Slava and I took away the equipment and, if we find it, the remains of our unfortunate rat. And then, with all this belongings, we intended to show up where necessary and forget about this damned place forever. Having opened the shutter, we stood for about 5 minutes, eyes bulging. The courtyard has changed. No, there were no rivers of blood or hordes of demons. Some of the paint has peeled off, revealing the crimson squiggles of the letters under the plaster. The same as they were on the window, only there were many more. On the floor, where we heard the squeak of a rat, there was a dark crimson stain. Swallowing a lump in the throat, we nevertheless decided to rise. I stood at the bottom of the tower and caught the hastily dropped cameras. The uninterruptible power supply was too heavy to be dragged back. Lie down, nothing will happen to him. Even though evening had not yet set in, we wanted to get out of here before the first patch of fog appeared over the edge of the roof. When the last camera fell into my hands, Slava began to descend the stairs. For a moment he froze, looking somewhere to the side. I followed his gaze and felt my heart skip a beat as thin serpents of fog rolled over the edge of the roof and crawled in our direction. Live, I called out to my comrade, who had fallen into a stupor. And he, as if waking up from a dream, diligently worked with his hands and feet, descending the stairs. Convinced that he had come down, I rushed to the stairs. But the damn place didn't want to let me go so easily. A couple of meters stretched into a desperate sprint for 100. I immediately flew into the winch, causing the structure to stagger. Glory ran up a moment later. I wrapped the wires from the cameras around my forearm and started down the stairs. Slava chose a faster way. He jumped into the winch cradle and pulled the lever that released the cable. With a howl, the basket rushed down, the string of the broken cable howled high. The face of my comrade twisted with horror flashed before me, and Slava found himself on the ground of the courtyard, bruised, but alive. Using my arms and legs, I climbed down the brackets, tossed the cameras in, and threw down the cable attached to the battery, ready to pull my friend to safety. The fog had already rolled over the edge of the roof and was descending in whitish flakes. Slava grabbed the cable and, desperately growling and sniffing, climbed up. But durable, designed for heavy loads, the synthetic rope was slippery in itself. So my friend's sweaty hands also did him a disservice. Not having overcome even 2 meters, he slipped and fell down into the fog that was already knee-deep. I will never forget his cry. I do not know what the unfortunate rat felt, but I have never heard such pain and agony in a human voice. Glory emerged from the fog. His skin was covered with blisters the size of a pea, which rapidly filled with some kind of black rubbish and burst literally before our eyes. Drops of black muck grew into new blisters, and those also burst, spraying black pus and drops of blood. Growling and flashing eyes full of tears, he climbed up again. I pulled with all my strength, and after a couple of seconds his hands appeared at the edge of the balcony. I grabbed his arm and pulled him out onto the balcony. Together we entered the room. A window slammed, a blind clanged, and we found ourselves on the floor. Breathing heavily, Slava mumbled something inaudibly. I briefly examined him and was horrified. The whole body was covered with some kind of abscesses or something like that. The skin turned black in places and covered with scabs. On barely bending legs, I went to the phone. It was necessary to call an ambulance, or the police, or damn, with trembling hands, I dialed the number and listened to the beeps, mothering idle operators to myself. Nah, idle. I jumped in place and turned around. Glory stood at the door. The head was tilted to one side, the jaw dropped, some kind of muddy green goo was dripping from it. Almost all of the skin was blackened and covered in scabs. The eyes bulged, turning his face into some kind of nightmarish demonic mask. Nah, Gierv idul, repeated the creature, and shuffled in my direction. I did as my instincts dictated to me. I grabbed the meat hatchet that hung next to the kitchen utensil and stuck it between the freak's eyes. I spent almost a month in a rehabilitation center. Gradually, the memories faded, the nightmares receded, and the grief of loss stopped driving me to the edge of the roof or to the bottom of the bottle. Dvach was found dead in his darkroom. He was holding exposed photographs in his hands, and he appeared to have burned the film before his heart stopped. His face was contorted into a grimace of horror. I don't know what he encountered there, and I don't want to know. I've had enough of my nightmares. The necessary authorities did not believe me. And who would have believed? I tried to show recordings of video cameras, which, in particular, captured a hellish landscape and dozens of figures slowly wandering in the fog, but at first they simply sent me, and then they almost put me in a psychiatric hospital. And I had to go to the turnout with confession supposedly. I killed a friend. They couldn't unlock it here anymore. Slava was listed as missing, and they had to go to my house. By that time, a bunch of decaying organic matter remained from his body. But I showed the window. By that time the courtyard had changed. The paint was completely peeled off, and all the walls, from top to bottom, were covered with ornate terrible symbols. A week later, people in civilian clothes came to visit me. I pretended to believe that they were from some research institute. They pretended to believe. As if I believed. I told them everything I knew and everything as it happened. I don't know what they were doing there, but a month later there was a gas explosion in the house. Fortunately, no one was hurt. The next day I went to the ruins. Little was left of the house, a couple of load-bearing walls, and a lonely, slightly crooked window. behind which one could see only a clear sky and, if one stood up very correctly, a piece of a brick wall with dark crimson symbols. I wonder what if someday rains and bad weather will wash away those squiggles that we drew with a marker.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.